Who is the third who always walks beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there's always another walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I don't know whether a man or woman, but who is that on the other side of you? These lines from the 1922 poem called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot speaks of the experience where someone feels an unseen presence close by during perilous experiences, a phenomenon that's become known as third man syndrome. The poem by Eliot was inspired by an account from Sir Ernest Shackleton, who gave one of the earliest reported accounts of the third man syndrome. Shackleton was an explorer who led 3 British expeditions to the Antarctic and was one of the principal figures of what is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, which is the name given to the exploration of the continent of Antarctica, which began at the end of the 19th century, where 17 major expeditions were launched from 10 different countries. Shackleton's experience with this phenomenon came during his 1914 to 1917 Antarctic expedition, which was his third and his final expedition. The plan was to make the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent. Just 2 days after the ship had left its home port, their ship, called the Endurance, entered the pack ice. For several weeks after that, the ship would struggle its way through leads in the ice. Progress was slow, but they were making progress. That is until mid-January 1915, where progress would ground to a halt. Getting crushed by ice from all sides, the ship became stuck. Worse still, the ice was drifting, taking the ship with it. The crew of the Endurance would spend months trying to free the ship from the ice, but to no avail. Shackleton would eventually order the crew to abandon ship on October 27, 1915. The ship, now damaged from the ice, would sink shortly afterwards. The crew would escape with 3 lifeboats and limited supplies, and traveled through the shrinking ice pack for months as they tried to reach land, which they eventually did on April 14, 1916, when they reached the uninhabited and remote island known as Elephant Island. After selecting 5 crew members to join him, Shackleton would then set sail 10 days later to find help. He would land on King Haakon Bay on May 10th. After arriving there and resting for a bit, Shackleton would then set out with 2 crew members to try to reach the whaling station at Stromness, while 2 would remain behind at camp. The trek was long and very difficult, but they did eventually reach Stromness on May 20th. Shackleton would then quickly arrange for a rescue ship. All members of the crew of the Endurance survived. In 1919, in his book called South, Shackleton would write about his strange experience with an unseen presence. In the book, he writes that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. This account resulted in other survivors of extreme hardship coming forward and sharing their experiences with this third man. The concept of third man syndrome or third man factor was popularized by writer John Geiger in his 2009 book, The Third Man Factor: Surviving the Impossible. Geiger had spent 5 years collecting examples of this very phenomenon. One such example came from British explorer Frank Smythe. Best remembered for his mountaineering in the Alps as well as the Himalayas, where he almost became the first person to summit Mount Everest in 1933. And it was during this attempt that Smythe had this experience. It had been a nearly disastrous journey to the top. The party had to fall back as they found themselves unable to make it through the sweeping wind, snow, ice, and the low oxygen. Smythe, however, had elected to continue, so he would attempt to reach the top of Everest by himself. In the end, he also had to abandon this attempt, and he missed it by only 304 meters or about 1,000 feet. Smythe would later recount this journey in his diary, where he described the feeling of not being alone at all. In fact, this feeling was so strong that at one point during his solo ascent, he had stopped for a moment to rest. He would then reach into his pocket, pull out a slab of mint cake, broke it in half, and then turn to share with this other person that he felt was with him. This other person who wasn't there. Smythe would write that this feeling was so strong that it had removed any loneliness that he might have felt during the ascent otherwise. While it's more commonly associated with mountaineering and climbers and hikers, it does not just appear to them. In fact, anyone who's in a perilous situation might find themselves experiencing this phenomenon. For instance, cave divers might also experience this phenomenon. In 1997, University of Kentucky geologist and cave diver Stephanie Schwabe found herself trapped in an underwater cave in the Bahamas. She had embarked on a dive in a cave called the Mermaid's Lair. The Mermaid's Lair is an inland blue hole on the south side of the Grand Bahama Island. A blue hole is a flooded cavern or a sinkhole, visible from the surface and stretched deep underwater, with many of them offering complex underwater cave systems. The Mermaid's Lair in the Bahamas is one such blue hole. It was given its name to keep children from playing in the caves. It was said that the caves were the home of a mermaid that would pull little children into the water and into its lair. For Stephanie Schwabe, the cave had been a place that she and her husband had explored many times. Her husband was British cave explorer Rob Palmer, who had been an expert on the blue holes of the Bahamas. Sadly, he had died during a dive in the Red Sea only 3 weeks earlier. Still grieving for her husband, Stephanie elected to dive at the Mermaid's Lair alone. Her goal was to collect soil samples, which she did as soon as she neared the floor of the cave. She did not look away from this task until it was time to return to the surface. It was only then that she realized that she could not find the guideline. The guideline is a lifeline for divers exploring caves, as it's often the only way they know which way to go to reach the surface. With the guideline missing, Stephanie was in a very dangerous predicament, which she of course realized, and she became angry, both at herself for getting in this position and at her husband for not being there with her. In the middle of her rage, she then noticed that her surroundings seemed to get brighter, as if someone had turned on a light in the cave. She also felt a sense of calm wash over her, as if there was someone else in the cave with her, helping her calm down. She would then remember something that her husband Rob had told her. Believe you can, believe you can't. Either way, you're right. With that renewed sense of calm, Stephanie was able to find her guideline and return to the surface, with only a little oxygen left. Another account from Geiger's book comes from September 11th, 2001. Early that morning, a worker named DiFransesco was in the South Tower of the World Trade Center trying to make sense of what had just happened. There had been some kind of explosion. Even worse than that, he realized that he was above where this explosion had occurred. He was above the 81st floor. Realizing that he had to make it out, he located the only operative staircase and then began struggling down. Between the debris and the smoke, it was not an easy descent. Breathing became more and more difficult, and Ron at some points started thinking that he would not make it. It was then that he felt something lead him down the stairs, some kind of presence. It didn't touch him or grab him, but he definitely felt as if something was leading him. Trusting this presence, whatever it was, Ron elected to follow it, all the way down. It was only when he neared the exit and the safety of the outside that he felt this presence vanish, as if it had done its job. Ron would be the last person to make it out of the South Tower before it collapsed, and he would be one of only 4 people who were able to escape from above the 81st floor. One thing I always try to do in my videos is find theories, possible explanations, anything on both sides of a strange phenomenon, or a strange event, or a cryptid event. Because I find it interesting how people can interpret it so differently. In the case of the third man syndrome, it's not that easy, because we don't know. We don't know what causes it. Not really. We can speculate and guess, but that's all it is. And given the fact that this phenomenon only seems to occur in catastrophic scenarios, it's unlikely that it will be fully studied. Geiger writes in his book that while there are some interesting science behind this phenomenon, he believes that a spiritual explanation makes more sense. Of course, some have put forth theories that are more scientific and say that it might be a coping mechanism, that your brain is trying to protect you and is presenting this idea of someone being there to help calm you down and help you focus. Others have theorized that it could be the effects of the situation at hand, such as cold, exhaustion, or hypoxia. Also adrenaline or stress. As I said, we don't know. It's unlikely that we will fully know. And I'm sure that most of us have had an experience where we felt that we weren't alone when we should have been. That feeling, though, is often very uncomfortable, eerie, or even scary at times, depending on, well, the circumstances of when you experience it. What makes the third man syndrome so interesting, though, is that the experience is more a positive one. It's not an eerie feeling, it's a comforting feeling, it's a calm feeling. And that's a word that often appears when people describe experiencing this phenomenon. Comfort. It's comforting. Whether it is spiritual, supernatural, or just your own brain trying to protect you, this phenomenon and the fact that it happens in situations of danger does indicate that in some way we are never truly alone. And that thought is a comforting one.